Hi guys, Dr. Cliff AuD here at Audacity 2018 for the ADA convention, and I'm here at the APSO booth with Dr. John Coverstone. John, thank you for having me.
Absolutely.
I know it's been a long conference up to this point, so I appreciate the time. So what is APSO?
So Audiology Practice Standards Organization is a group of audiologists that got together to develop practice standards for the profession of audiology.
And that's really important. So one of my things, if you guys follow my YouTube channel to any degree, you'll notice that I talk a lot about certain standards that I believe should be met, certain best practices that should be met. Particularly real ear measurement is probably the single most hot topic item on my channel. So where do best practices fit in with certain standards that you guys are trying to create?
Well, and one thing to recognize is that practice standards are not always best practices. Best practices, by definition, are often things which are emerging, which maybe everybody has not implemented in their clinic yet, simply because they can't, because perhaps it requires new equipment and they have to budget for it and get that. Perhaps it requires additional education so that they can develop the skills and the knowledge to do that. And so best practices are not something we're necessarily trying to promote through this organization, although we certainly hope that everyone strives to achieve those best practices whenever possible. But we want to create standards of practice. And so a standard is something which is really the minimal acceptable level of practice. So it's something that all the audiologists around the country, as community of audiologists, have gotten together and defined as being, if you're in front of a patient that has this kind of condition, in this kind of a situation, this is what you need to be doing.
Right.
So that's a standard.
So kind of removing the variability out of how you could be treated for a certain condition that you have.
Correct.
Right?
Because if you go see an audiologist in Miami or Seattle or New York or Omaha, you would have a reasonable expectation of receiving the same care from all those audiologists. And that's what standards are going to help us do, is to make sure that we're leveling that playing field so that everyone is practicing at the same high level.
Right, and so this isn't something that is new. There are plenty of other industries that have standards set to where their industry, they follow these standards at least, right?
Absolutely. There are medical practice standards. Every profession is developing standards. Optometry has standards. Nursing has standards, which are very broad because of what they do, but they have some standards. Dentists have standards. Chiropractors have some standards. And so it's something that we want to have in audiology too, and we want to make sure that we are trying to encourage everyone to adhere to those standards, to practice at that level. So not just develop them, but then make sure that we're following them.
Exactly. We got to follow them. We can't just make standards and not essentially enforce to some degree. Is that what you're talking?
And we can't really enforce the standards. There's no punitive measure. There's no consequence that we as APSO can put forth for those people. But what we can do, and this is something we all can do in audiology and our patients as well, is create an expectation. An expectation that we will all practice at that standard. An expectation, for instance, that we would all do some kind of verification. Real ear measurement isn't the only way to verify. It's probably the top tier. It's probably the most accepted method and has the most research evidence behind it, and that's why you're promoting it. But we want to at least make sure everyone's doing some kind of verification, and we hope that they would do real ear.
Right, absolutely. So I think that this is an important step forward for audiology as a profession, but with the goal in mind of really making the patient and the consumer benefit from this.
Absolutely.
So what are some of the speed bumps? What are some of the difficulties with actually going and establishing these standards?
Well, in order to establish standards, we have to bring the whole profession of audiology together. We can't just be a small group of people sitting in a room developing these standards and expect them to go out and be accepted by everyone. For one, they have to be evidence-based. And so we have to go out and find that evidence, whether it's in audiology or even outside of audiology for some of our practices. We have to make sure that this is something that everyone has access to as an audiologist, can review, can comment on. Everyone needs to participate. That's really important, because if the whole profession isn't involved, then the whole profession isn't going to follow it. And then we also have to be transparent about our processes, make sure they're very open, and then we have to make sure that everyone can access the materials that we create, and we are making sure that they're all publicly available.
Yeah, I was going to say, when you say everyone can access, you're not talking about the providers themselves, the audiologists themselves, you're talking about the consumer as well.
They will all be publicly available on the website, and so everyone from a physician to a consumer patient to an insurance company perhaps can go out and look at those standards and see what they are, and they can use those as well.
Right, so where are we starting at right now? What type of standards are we trying to create at the very early on in this process?
The very first standard we're going to create, which didn't happen this way before this reason, but it's kind of ironic, is an intake standard. So we're actually, that wasn't the reason, but it happened that way. And so we are starting with the beginning of the process. Right. When a patient walks into our office, what should we be doing with them? What are the basic things that we need to be looking at, all audiologists, for that patient? And you may not be an expert in the area of dizzy and balance.
Right.
You may not be an expert in the area of tinnitus, but there are a few basic things that we can do to make sure we're looking at that with our patients, and then referring them to the appropriate source.
Terrific.
And so that's what we're focusing on first here.
I gotcha. And so I know it's kind of hard to speculate, like, end game for this, like how long it's going to take, because it is a very in-depth process.
It is.
Making sure that we develop these standards appropriately, right, as an organization.
Yep.
But what is expectation level for this, of when it would be like we have a really solid core, set of, standards?
I think probably within a couple of years.
Okay.
Just to be reasonable. It would be great if it went faster.
Right.
If we get a sudden influx of funding, then perhaps we can, move them along a little quicker and pay for, the costs of those a little more quickly. But I think probably it's reasonable to think that within a couple of years we'll have diagnostic and treatment standards for adults and for kids and some other things we want to work on, like the dizziness and balance protocols and things like that.
Very good, very good. Well, John, thank you so much for your time. Is there anything else you think that consumers should be aware of with developing these standards?
I think the main thing is just to know that they're out there so that you can be looking for them and so that you can ask good questions.
Right.
So when you're looking for an audiologist, when looking for a care provider, first of all, look to these, and they will let you know what kind of things you should be asking. Are you doing X, Y, and Z in your diagnostic appointments? Are you doing A, B, and C if I'm looking for hearing aids? And you can ask people those questions, and if you don't get the answers that you want, maybe ask somewhere else.
Right. Being better informed is going to result in better treatment for yourself, right? So educating yourself is extremely important in this whole process. Otherwise, us doing standards is not going to matter, right, if the consumer doesn't pay attention to that to some degree.
Yeah, not a whole lot, and that really applies in any industry, any profession. I mean, if you go to your physician and you're constantly asking questions about what they're doing for certain illnesses, they're probably going to make sure that they're educated and skilled and doing the tests they need to that have been designated as acceptable by their profession.
Well, that's terrific.
Whereas if nobody asks, maybe it's human nature. You have to take a few shortcuts. Maybe, I'm not feeling that hot today, so I'm just going to kind of not do this one thing. And so we kind of all have to keep the pressure on ourselves and each other.
And I can tell, just from speaking with other audiologists here this weekend, we want these standards. We want there to be, a certain standard that we have to uphold to make sure that we are doing things the right way. And I think that this is the way that we go about getting that done.
Yes, I agree.
So terrific, John. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
I think this was very valuable. Guys, that's it for this video. Make sure you stay tuned on Hearing Tracker for future videos.